to preach on this subject of rearing children, but I really wanted it to be kind of interactive. I want to hear your input, hear your thoughts, and so thank you for those who have submitted different questions and all. This last week we finally put the box back there and had several come in, but this message tonight actually addresses 3 different papers, and so I'm gonna need some more. So I got one tonight, and if you got any others, like I said, I got plenty that I can preach on, so don't worry about that. But I'd love to hear if you got questions that you really do want to know. You don't have to do it just because I'm trying to ask people to. But if you do have some legitimate questions that you kind of like to hear a biblical point of view, or some like he was saying, just experience and different things. And once again, I want to reiterate that it's not saying that I'm the perfect father and I've done everything right by any means, but having experience and looking at the Bible and saying, what does the Bible say? We want to look at biblical principles, maybe backed with my and my wife's experience in raising kids, and just trying to give some counsel. It's like biblical counsel. I don't do a lot of counseling, like one-on-one, come meet in my office and we'll talk about that. I'm not against it, but I think a lot of that can be just addressed from the pulpit, and so this is an opportunity to do that. So tonight, the title of the message is Partiality in raising children. So what's partiality? Well, kind of like favoritism, right? Being partial to one child over another child. And it's an interesting question, and it was actually something along those lines was asked a couple times, and you would think, like, who does that? Like, what do you mean partiality? But if you really start thinking about it, like it's something that we got to consider, and there's a lot of Bible examples of it. Okay, so the way I'm going to address this tonight is I'm going to look at 3 stories, and we're going to take a look at those stories and talk about them a little bit, and get some advice from those in regards to showing partiality. Now, at our house, it's just kind of always been a joke, and I think I mentioned this recently, but our kids grew up, we kind of had a running joke. If someone does something for you, brings you a cup of coffee, like, oh, you're my favorite child, right? Or we will make a joke, everybody's equally our favorite, which is kind of, sounds backwards, but that's not possible, right? You can't equally be a favorite. But anyway, so we'll be like, this is my favorite son, When it was just Zachary and Sharice, this is my favorite son, this is my favorite daughter. And then Braden comes along, this is my favorite older son, and this is my favorite younger son. And I'm going to mess this up again like I did last time. Viviana comes along, it's like, oh, you're my favorite daughter that's living at home, You're my favorite daughter not living at home. Just being silly about that. But in my mind, thinking about somebody actually having a favorite child just sounds cruel. Like, to me, like those are your children. How could you prefer one over the other? And in my mind, it just seems like, that's not even a possibility. Now, I would say this, that from a child's perspective, just maybe look at your own life and your own siblings and growing up. There are times you probably felt like, oh, my parents prefer my brother or my sister or whatever. Or maybe you felt like the one that, was the preferred child. But I would say most of the time, though a child might feel like that, it's probably just their perspective. They're probably just looking at it because of the situation and feel like maybe they're showing partiality to one child over the other. But I think it's important that our children know, okay? Like, if you get the sense that a child really feels like, man, you don't love me like you love the other child, I think it's very important that, especially part of your responsibility as training your children and helping them grow up in a house and be healthy, they have a responsibility to their health, right? Mental health and emotional health and all that. I think it's very important that they don't feel like you don't love them as much as you love another child, because even though that in your heart and in your mind that's not true, they could literally feel that way for one reason or another. And I think it's important to kind of make sure they know, like, I don't love one more than the other. Okay, but we want to look at what does the Bible say, and are there examples in the Bible? Now, a couple of thoughts on that too is from the child's perspective. Okay, so maybe children never really thought about this. If you're older, maybe you can understand what I'm saying a little bit better. Maybe you've already figured this out in life. But obviously, if you have multiple children they're not all going to be exactly the same. So raising a child is not going to be this cookie cutter. That's why it's hard if someone says, like, how did you do this? How did you handle this situation? Well, I don't know your kids. Like, I don't know what your kids need, and I might not be able to, give you an example exactly what we did with our children, because our children might be a little different. They might need things a little differently. So, with that in mind, you can understand children, if you have siblings, that your parents are going to have to know one child and know what they need and know what discipline they need and know what attention they need, as opposed to another child that they're like, I think that they can handle this, or I don't think they need to be disciplined in this area as much, because they're trying to deal with every child differently. And as a parent, I think everybody in here could probably relate to that and understand what that's like. You understand that some children have extra needs in one area or another. Some require more attention. It's just kind of like a need that they seem to have. One child might get disciplined in a different manner based on their needs. Some children, spanking is like a big deal. Like if you do that, you're going to get a spanking. They won't do it because they don't want a spanking. Other kids are weighing out their options, like, how bad of a spanking? It's only going to hurt for a minute or whatever. But what they don't want is a lecture from mom or dad saying, you really disappointed me. Some people are like, man, I'd rather get 10 spankings, as opposed to this look in mom and dad's eyes saying, you disappointed me. Like that's, and you just got to know what that child needs. We had one child, I won't mention his or her name, but they did not like any kind of punishment in public or around other people. That was like the big deal. Like, that was like the worst thing you could possibly do, is let somebody else see them get in trouble. You know what I mean? And so you just kind of know your kids, and obviously that's going to look like to some people, or even to your children if you're not careful, like you're being partial. Like, hey, you didn't do this for them. Why'd you do it for me? Or you know. This is a real situation that comes up. And if you don't think that's a real situation comes up, but why did I get two, different, and actually three I'm going to address, so kind of three different questions that were related to this. So it is definitely an issue that people deal with, being partial in the raising of kids. So we want to know what the Bible says, and like I said, there are three stories. The reason I didn't have a reading before the message is because we're going to read these stories. And the first one is Jacob and Esau, okay? Look at Genesis chapter 25. Genesis 25. And I'm not going to read these stories in their entirety, but I'm going to try to give a good portion and cover what we need to know about these stories. Probably familiar, I would imagine. Probably everybody in here has a pretty good understanding of the stories. Genesis 25, look at starting in verse 21. And Isaac entreated the Lord for his wife because she was barren, and the Lord was entreated of him, and Rebekah his wife conceived. And the children struggled together within her, and she said, If it be so, why am I thus? And she went to inquire of the Lord. And the Lord said unto her, 2 nations are in thy womb, and 2 manner of people shall be separated from thy bowels. And the one people shall be stronger than the other people, and the elder shall serve the younger. And when her days to be delivered were fulfilled, behold, there were twins in her womb. And the first came out red all over like a hairy garment, and they called his name Esau. And after that came his brother out, and his hand took hold of Esau's heel, and his name was called Jacob. And Isaac was 80 years old when she bare them. And the boys grew, and Esau was a cunning hunter, a man of the field, and Jacob was a plain man dwelling in tents. I don't think it means plain as in like a simple man. I think it just means like he was in the plains, not in the mountains and the hills and all that kind of stuff. Maybe I'm wrong on that, but dwelling in tents. And Isaac loved Esau because he did eat of his venison, but Rebekah loved Jacob. And Jacob sought pottage, and Esau came from the field, for he was faint. You probably know the story, how he ends up losing his birthright, and then later on in the story, he's going to be Jacob is going to, conspire with his mother tells him how to do this, and then they conspire together and they basically get the blessing for Jacob rather than Esau. Now, the thing about that is the Lord said that the younger is going to rule over the older, right? And so this was a blessing from God. I don't know if he said that she inquired of the Lord. I don't know if that means she went to the temple, talked to the priest, talked to a prophet, and they talked, with God and were able to tell them what God said. Like, I don't know how that looked. I don't know how that came about. But this was knowledge that she was aware of. And then she has twins and all these things are going on. But it seems to me that for whatever reason, she never tells her husband that this is the way it's supposed to be. Instead, she tries to finagle this and make it to where the youngest son gets the blessing over that. It appears like for whatever reason, it doesn't seem like Isaac is aware about this prophecy. Okay, and so the question here in this story is: does the Bible say that Isaac loved Esau more than Jacob? And before I answer that question, if it does say that, obviously that doesn't make it right. Okay, we understand that this isn't just because the example's in the Bible doesn't mean like, hey, this is an example. Like, we can love one child more than the other one. But actually, does it actually say that he loved one more than the other? Now, you could definitely say it's implied if you go to look back at verse 26. So you're in Genesis 25, verse 26. And after that came his brother out, and his hand took hold of Esau's heel, and his name was called Jacob. And what am I doing here? Keep reading. And the boys grew, verse 27, and Esau was a cunning hunter, man of the field. Jacob was a plain man dwelling in tents. And Isaac loved Esau because he did eat of his venison. But Rebekah loved Jacob. Now you can say, well, it's implied right there. Rebekah favored Jacob, and Isaac favored Esau. Okay? But it doesn't really say that Isaac didn't love Jacob, or that it doesn't even say that he loved Esau more than Jacob. It says he loved him, and get this, it says he loved him because he made him venison. That's a weird reason. That would be a weird reason to prefer one child over the other. Like, well, I just love this child because he can make some deer meat, The other child, he's dwelling in tents and he's a plain man. He's not hairy like my other son, but this guy, man, he knows how to make some venison, right? That's the implication you can kind of get, and you start thinking, but that's a weird reason to love a child. You know what I mean? So I think you could probably, just my thinking, again, if that is the case, it doesn't mean that it's right. But I would just say, as a parent and thinking through the situation, it probably doesn't necessarily mean that he just loved Esau more than Jacob, didn't care about Jacob, man, he just really loved Esau. And Rebekah didn't care anything about Esau, she just loved her baby boy, Jacob. And so we really don't see that exactly, but the story, the reason it says this is because the story is setting something up. It's setting up what's going to happen, and it's setting up the story, I don't think Isaac is so petty that he prefers Esau simply because of his venison. Okay. However, think of it this way: if I am out, if you look at our house, you come to our house and you see me out in the garden, okay, and Zachary and I are working in the garden because that's kind of his thing. He likes to do. And I like plants too. I like landscaping. I like all this kind of stuff. So you see me and Zachary, and we're talking about these things, and we're sharing pictures. Well, hey, I got this plant. I'd like to do that. And you might look at it and say, like, man, he loves Zachary because he likes gardening or something like that. And you might look at it, and if I'm telling the story in that way, you might kind of like overlook the fact that, yeah, but I love Braden too. Okay, so then from the other perspective, let's say we're going fishing. Zachary doesn't care so much about fishing. And so we go fishing, and I'm just like, man, all right, Braden, are you ready? We're going to go fishing. Did you get your poles? Did you get your kayak? Did you get this? And we're going out there, and from that perspective, you could be like, hey, man, he loves his son because he likes fishing with them, and he likes doing these kind of things. What doesn't mean I don't love the other son? You see what I'm saying? It's kind of a situational deal. In this situation, like, we have a bond. We have something in common. And when it comes to raising children, this is something that happens. Like there's something that you might have in common with one child. A lot of times in a family, they'll be like, well, that child is just like me. And that could be good or bad. If they're just like you and it's something that you see in them that you don't like about yourself, it could come across like, hey, you don't love that person, you don't love that child because you're kind of always on them and you're always criticizing about something. And the thing is, actually, you do love them and you just don't want them to do that. You see some negative traits about yourself in them, and so you might ride them for that. But the opposite is true too. Like, maybe they're a lot like you in the sense that, man, you guys have some of the same interests, and you got, there's certain love language that you speak well together, whatever. So it might come across at some points like, am I preferring this child over the other child? No, it's just a situational partiality. Like you're just being partial to that child in this situation because you have something in common. Now, if you're a parent and you see like, hey, I'm spending a lot of time with this child, or I'm on this child, disciplining this child, and I'm neglecting this other child, if you truly love your children equally, what you should, then you need to recognize that and be like, it's time for me to spend a little bit of time with this child and find our interests and our things that keep us. And I do think that a parent needs to work at that. And it's not that at any point you necessarily actually have favor or have more love for one child than the other one. It's just you recognize, hey, I'm giving a little more attention to this child. I need to purpose to spend some time with this child and to impart certain things to them. Because it certainly could be a very negative thing, as we'll see in some of the other, even in this story, the way that it ends up, we can see what effect this has on the kids. But this is a situational type of a partiality where there's favor showed based on the current situation, at that time, and something that these two get along with or whatever. Look at verse 22. Genesis 25:22. And the children struggled together within her, and she said, if it be so, why am I thus? And she went to inquire of the Lord. And the Lord said unto her, 2 nations are in thy womb, and 2 manner of people shall be separated from thy bowels, and the one people will be stronger than the other people, and the elder shall serve the younger. So again, when you look at Rebekah's situation, and why is she preferring Jacob, and why is she helping him and putting this hair in his arm so he looks like Esau so he can deceive his father, all these weird things. Is it just like, oh, she just loves her baby boy so much or whatever? Well, in this situation, I don't know why she doesn't talk to Jacob about it, to Isaac about it, but in this situation, she knows that Jacob's supposed to be getting this blessing, and she feels like she has to help him along, and so it's kind of showing partiality, but it's a situational thing. It doesn't mean that she didn't care about Esau, okay? And so that's just one story, one example that you might think about. Okay, another one here, very popular story, Joseph. Okay, so now you got Jacob and Esau, and then Jacob has 12 children, and second to youngest one is Joseph, and you're probably familiar with that story. So go to chapter 37. Genesis 37. So thirsty. All right, start at verse 1. And Jacob dwelt in the land wherein his father was a stranger, in the land of Canaan. These are the generations of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was feeding the flock with his brethren, and the lad was with the sons of Bilhah and with the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives. And Joseph brought unto his father an evil report. Now Israel loved Joseph more than all his children, because he was the son of his old age. And he made him a coat of many colors. And when his brethren saw that their father loved him more than all the brethren, they hated him, and could not speak peaceably unto him. And Joseph dreamed a dream, and he told it his brethren, and they hated him yet the more. And he said unto them, Hear, I pray you, this dream that I have dreamed, for behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and lo, my sheaf arose and also stood upright, and behold, your sheaf stood round about and made obeisance to my sheaf. And his brethren said unto him, Shalt thou indeed reign over us, or shalt thou indeed have dominion over us? And they hated him yet the more for his dreams and for his words. And he dreamed yet another dream, and he told it his brethren, and said, Behold, I have dreamed a dream more. And behold, the sun and the moon and the 11 stars made obeisance to me. And he told it to his father and to his brethren, and his father rebuked him and said unto him, What is this dream that thou hast dreamed? Shall I and thy mother and thy brethren indeed come and bow down ourselves to thee, to the earth? And his brethren envied him, but his father observed the saying. So you see, like, his father's like, maybe we will give obeisance to him one day. He's observing this. He's thinking about that. Kind of similar to Mary, now obviously Joseph was no Jesus, but remember Mary is like hiding these things in her heart and saying, whoa, I've got to be mindful of these things as it comes to pass, what was prophesied about Jesus. And yet his brothers are just looking at this thinking, what in the world? He already, is treated as a favorite, and he's loved more than all of the other brothers, and now here he's saying we're going to serve him and all this kind of stuff. And so this is a weird story, and from a parent's perspective of partiality. So does the Bible say that Jacob loved Joseph more than all of his other sons? Yes, that's exactly what it says. And they saw that, and it was like he wasn't hiding it. He's just like, hey, I'm going to give him this coat of many colors. Hey, he's going to have all these special privileges. Like he's my favorite son. I love him above all the others. I mean, it seems like he was just very open about that. And this, of course, caused a lot of problems. You continue reading the story, you can see what problems that caused. They hated him. His brothers, they envied him, it says in verse 11. Look at Colossians 3. This is a very important verse, I believe, as a parent. Okay, particularly a father. This is addressed to fathers, but it's true for mothers as well. And when you're constantly disciplining a child or criticizing them or just rebuking them for different things they do wrong, it's very important to understand this. Colossians chapter 3, starting in verse 20. Children, obey your parents in all things, for this is well-pleasing unto the Lord. Fathers, provoke not your children to anger, lest they be discouraged. And so, I'm sure that could apply to a lot of situations, provoking your children to anger, but I think it's very important to understand that you can drive a child to the point where they feel like, you know what, I'm never gonna make my parents happy anyway. I'm never gonna meet their approval in anything that I do, so why even try? That's the case, right? This is why growing up, like, I used to hate whenever people just are automatically like putting their child's future on them, like, before it even happens. You know what I'm saying? Like, man, you're going to be an ornery child. I can see that. I would hate whenever people would say about Sharice. They said, "Oh man, she's just like some would be like, they would insinuate like she's a tomboy, and she's just this little bully, and a bull in a china closet, and she's bossing the kids around. Now look at Sharice today. Does that define her to you?" But in my mind, as a parent, I'm just like, no. We're still training our children. They still have a lot to learn. They still have a lot to go. Don't start assuming that just because you saw a child do a couple of things when they're younger, like, hey, this is what their future is going to be like. And then you always call them that, and you always say that about them, and to the point where they're just like, well, I guess that's what I'm going to be. And then they just kind of like fit into that mold that you've always put on them. Don't do that. Show them what's right. Guide them and direct them and help them to turn, to turn from whatever, if they're going the wrong direction. That's exactly what you're supposed to be doing as a parent and training them, okay? Remember what training is? You got a tree that's wanting to grow this way for whatever reason, and so you're taking something and you're training it to grow up straight, so you're pulling it this way, right? That's your whole life of training. So don't just be like, well, I guess that's the way they want to go. Remember, that's what the modern version said. Train them up in the way that they want to go, or whatever it said. Like, it's kind of like in their way, whatever their way is, just train them in that way. It's like, that's not what the Bible's saying. training implies that you're fighting against what they naturally want to do. Naturally, we got to bent to sin. Naturally, foolishness is bound in the heart of a child. So it's our job to train them. And so if you see a child growing that a certain way, you got to gently bring them the other direction. But if you're constantly, just saying, oh, you're no good and you're not going to succeed and, I'm not happy with this, and no matter what they do makes you happy, they're just going to be like, you know what? I might as well just let them yell at me. I might as well just let them spank me. I might as well, because they're never going to be happy anyway. And I've probably shared this 1,000 times, but I remember when I was at UPS and I took a management class, and they gave this, they asked this question. They said, should you always be positive and encouraging to the people, to your employees? Should you always be harsh and negative to your employees, or should you sometimes be positive and sometimes be negative? You'd be surprised how many people said you should just always be positive and encouraging and just help them. But here's the problem: if you do that, then a child's never going to change because they don't ever get the negative. Okay, so like say you're working with an employee and an employee's doing something wrong, and you're just like, well, man, you're trying, you're doing a good job, and then they never feel like a motivation to try any harder, right? Because they're always you're always so positive that they're just like, I guess I'm great. Okay, but the opposite is always being negative, and there's nothing they can do, and they're just like, hey, it doesn't matter. Why try harder if they're not going to be happy anyway? And so then they just don't even try harder. So the best, most successful way to help somebody to get better is, and this is funny, they said something along the lines of like, for every 4 negatives, okay, hey, you're doing this wrong, hey, you're not being safe, hey, make sure for every 4 negatives you throw in a positive, okay, but you're doing this really well, something along those lines. And I remember at that time I was in Bible college, or no, I wasn't yet. I wasn't in Bible college yet, but I remember thinking that the Bible is kind of that way, When we're supposed to preach the word, right? We're supposed to reprove, rebuke, and exhort. If you think about that, that's like reprove and rebuke are kind of negatives, and exhort is kind of a positive. Like, hey, you're doing this wrong, and let me tell you why you're doing this wrong. It wasn't right. And now, helping them to do good. That's kind of the case. And there are other examples in the Bible where it's like that. It's like a negative, positive. And that's the way that it should be. Like, give the criticism, tell them what they're doing wrong, but also show them that you love them, because at some point you could provoke them to wrath. You can provoke them they're going to get discouraged, and they're going to be like, well, you know what? Why even try? I'm not going to be loved anyway. And so that would be a terrible thing. And I don't think any good parent, decent parent, would ever want that of their child, but they don't even realize sometimes that they're pushing their child in that way. And so I would say, even showing partiality to one of your children over to the other, which Jacob was obviously doing, it just says he loved Joseph more than his other children. It's obviously going to discourage his other children. Like, hey, we're never going to meet up to the expectation he has. Like, we're never going to be Joseph. And so we don't want that for our other children. We want to balance that out and try to think about how we can show our love. We do love all of our children, but how can we show our love equally? By spending equal amount of time, by being involved in their lives in an equal way. All these are things that as parents we should try to do. And so, but let me mention this. Why did Jacob love Joseph more than all the other children? Well, let's look at what it says. Let me see here. Verse 3. 37, verse 3. Now Israel loved Joseph more than all his children, because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a coat of many colors. Now, we understand this story, and if you go to verse 2, it even mentions, and the lad was with the sons of Bilhah and with the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives. Okay? Now, Bilhah and Zilpah were the handmaids of Leah and Rachel. Right? Jacob's got way too many wives here. Okay? But you remember, he's kind of tricked. We were talking about this earlier, and Leah, don't know how it happened, okay? But he's married to Leah, and he goes in and consummates the marriage, and wakes up in the morning, and she's like, "Hi," and it's Leah. It's not Rachel. Okay, it's a weird thing. How did it happen? I don't know. And so he's tricked, and so he goes back and says, "Hey, I wanted to marry Rachel. Leah's tender-eyed, but anyway, Rachel's fair to look upon." So anyway, it's an interesting story. Kind of has some comical parts in it. And so then Laban says, "Hey, well, if you keep working 7 more years, yeah, I'll give you my other daughter too." The whole thing is bad. Okay, it's a bad situation. So now you got Leah and you got Rachel, and guess what? They're both competing for the husband's affections. So naturally, Leah has children. What's that going to do for Rachel? She's going to be jealous, and she wants children. Okay, now eventually she's like, "Well, I can't have children, so why don't you take my handmaid to wife and bear children, and then they can be my children. I can raise them." And that's just digging down and making things worse, right? And then Leah's like, "Hey, I got to have more children, so here, have my handmaid." And so now he's got 4 wives. He's having children with them, and the only wife that he really loves is Rachel. All the others are just like wanting children with him, but he's just interested in Rachel. Okay, and this is a terrible situation. But what do you think this does to the children? I mean, the text shows us what it does to the children. The children grow up and they're just like, it's kind of like a class system. When Rachel finally has her own children, and at the beginning of this, when they're all envious towards Joseph, like he's the youngest child, and I'm getting their names mixed up. Okay, and Jacob says, "This is my child of my old age." Okay, he's older and all this kind of stuff. He finally has the child from Rachel, and it's just like, obviously he dotes on this child. Now, granted, the other children should be able to handle this. Okay, when we had Viviana, like our rest of our kids are adults pretty much. I mean, they're all adults, and so it's like, okay, you're going to have a new sibling. There's no need to be jealous. We're going to dote on your sibling. She's going to be our favorite child in your eyes. And they're like, "She's our favorite child too." Like, we understand that. It's a baby. Like, it's a child in your old age. And they should be old enough to understand that. Okay, but whatever the case, they don't like it. But why don't they like it? It's not because, this is the baby, and they're like doting on the baby and all this stuff. No, there was a grudge from the beginning, I can guarantee you, because it was just like, "Oh, he doesn't treat my mom right. He doesn't care about us." And then whenever Joseph is finally born, it's like, okay, he only cares about Joseph. He doesn't care about. You can see how that could happen. Okay, so I want to address this, and this come up. We got a couple situations in the church where this might come up, but this is a situation that comes up in homes where there's step parents, okay, or blended homes, or whatever they call it. It could be a genuine problem that people have to deal with, or a situation that they have to deal with. So let me try to I can't speak from experience on this, but I can try to give some advice. Okay, first of all, it should be understood, your biological child is almost always going to have a closer place in your heart. I can't imagine that not being the case. Okay, so you marry into a family in your heart, right? Because it's your flesh and blood. I don't think anybody would necessarily expect anything different, but then you to have for your child a special place in your heart. That's my flesh and blood, as opposed to the child that you married into that position. But on the basis of authority and responsibility, okay, because as a parent you have that authority placed upon you, right? And particularly as a father into that relationship, you are now the authority over the children, and you have a responsibility to those children, just like you do to your own children, to provide for them, to protect them, and all those things that a parent has. And so on the basis of your responsibility and your authority, a parent should try hard not to show favoritism that would provoke the stepchildren to wrath or envy or jealousy, just like we see in this story. obviously Jacob didn't even try. Maybe it's because he was the favorite of his mom, and he saw favoritism in his family. I don't know, but he didn't even try. Like it was obvious to everybody. Okay, and the text tells us that. And so I believe that just the responsibility of the parent is to show the love equally to those children, just like they're your own children. Okay, and at the same time, I think that the other children should have an understanding that is going to be natural. Okay, and it's not that they don't love you; it's that is their flesh and blood, and there's a certain bond there that you might never have. Now, there are some situations where previous marriage was bad, and a new marriage comes around, and that parent literally takes the place of a father or mother, and like that child doesn't really know any different. It's just like these are, and it's almost like they don't even really know that they're not flesh and blood. And that's probably, for the child's sake, the best situation. But I think, especially as you get older and you kind of understand how these things work, like it should be understood. Like give some mercy to the fact that there's going to be some partiality in the way that they parent. But at the same time, parents, it's your job, it's your responsibility to equally be authoritative, okay, to discipline equally, and to there's situations that are going to come up that I can't speak to by experience, but it seems like that you still have that responsibility, you still have that authority over them. And I would say this also to any step parents, just thinking about what I might be tempted to do or what you might see from time to time, and I would say this: don't try to overcompensate. You know what I'm saying? Like all of a sudden a step parent's like, man, I want to be the cool parent. I want them to like me, so I'm going to overcompensate. I that situation is always going to cause more problems, right? Because it's just going to be obvious that it's fake, and anytime a parent tries to be the cool parent for whatever reason, it's going to crash and burn. Okay, don't try to be the cool parent. It doesn't look cool to try to be cool. Does that make sense? You're either cool or you're not cool. Don't try to be cool. All right. I accepted a long time ago I'm not cool, and I don't care. All right. All right. So that's just the benefit of getting older. All right. So let's go to the third story. The third story, and there are a lot of other examples I'm sure we could bring up, but the third story, I want to go to the New Testament and look at the prodigal son and his brother. Luke 15. Luke 15, starting in verse 11. And I think this is told as a parable. I can't say 100% that this is a true story, but Jesus presents it. I was just thinking the other day about how awesome of a storyteller Jesus was, which it makes sense, considering who he is. But like all the great stories of the world, like you read that story and you're like, oh yeah, Jesus told a story like that. I mean, it's just like he told the best stories. And then people since then have just embellished them and changed the characters a little bit. But this is a great story. And it's told as though maybe it was a true story. I don't know. But he says, a certain man had 2 sons. And the younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the portion of goods that falleth to me. And he divided unto him his living. Now, that sounds like he just asked and his dad said, okay, here you go. But I would assume this is a conversation that would have gone back and forth and maybe got loud, and the child's like, hey, I don't, I'm old enough now and I'm going to go do my way and I don't want to be in. Who knows what this conversation sounded like, but long story short, the father gives the kid his portion of inheritance. He's a spoiled rich kid, okay, and he gets his inheritance. And 13, and not many days after, the younger son gathered all together and took his journey into a far country, and there wasted his substances with riotous living. And when he had spent all, there arose a mighty famine in the land, and he began to be in want. And he went and joined himself to a citizen of that country, and he sent him into his field to feed swine. which Jesus telling the story, mentioning swine would have been a big insult. Like it was the grossest, that's like the lowest place that they could probably be, because pigs were considered filthy. I mean, they are filthy, but anyway. And he would fain have filled his belly with the husk that the swine did eat, and no man gave unto him. And when he came to himself, he said, how many hired servants of my father's have bread enough and to spare, and I perish with hunger? I will arise and go to my father, and will say unto him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before thee, and am no more worthy to be called thy son. Make me as one of thy hired servants. And he arose and came to his father. But when he was yet a great way off, his father saw him, and had compassion, and ran and fell on his neck and kissed him. And the son said unto him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and in thy sight, and am no more worthy to be called thy son. But the father said unto his servants, Bring forth the best robe, and put it on him, and put a ring on his hand, and shoes on his feet, and bring hither the fatted calf, and kill it, and let us eat and be merry. For this my son was dead, and he is alive again. He was lost, and is found. And they began to be merry. Now his elder son was in the field, and as he came and drew nigh to the house, he heard music and dancing. And he called one of the servants and asked what these things meant. And they said unto him, Thy brother is come, and thy father has killed the fatted calf, because he has received him safe and sound. And he was angry, and would not go in. Therefore came his father out, and entreated him. And he answering said to his father, Lo, these many years do I serve thee, neither transgressed I at any time thy commandment, and yet thou never gavest me a kid, that I might make merry with my friends. But as soon as thy son was come, which hath devoured thy living with harlots, thou hast killed for him the fatted calf. And he said unto him, Son, thou art ever with me, and all that I have is thine. It was meet that we should make merry and be glad, for this thy brother was dead, and is alive again, and was lost, and is found. Now, that's a great story, and you can kind of put yourself in, at certain times, maybe in either one of those situations, okay? And in this story, obviously, it's told from the perspective of the prodigal son. That's why we call it the story of the prodigal son, right? It's all about the son that went out and he returned. But we don't really stop and consider until the end of the story, that a good portion of what Jesus is talking about has to do with that other son who's like, hey, I don't understand. Why did you receive him back? And why are you treating him this way? Like, he should be disciplined. He should be scolded. He shouldn't make you happy. And so you can see where the older brother is kind of feeling like, you're showing partiality. You're loving him more than me. Okay? And of course, that's not fair, because it's another situational partiality. And he explains to him, in fact, just the fact that he goes out and says, hey, how come you're not coming in? Shows that he loves his son. And he's like, hey, it's not fair that you're treating him this way. And he's like, look, you've been with me. You've got everything that I've got. Like, I've loved you, and I've showed you everything. And your brother, like, he's lost it all. Like, he already got his inheritance. He went out and blew it. But we're happy that he came back. And so we should do this. Okay. So anyway, he's making other applications with this story, but for the sake of this message, I think we can consider some things here. Now, obviously, you're going to have a better relationship with your child that's doing right. You know what I mean? Like, I use this as an analogy a lot of times when I'm preaching the gospel, and we're talking to somebody about how you can't lose your salvation, but God's going to discipline you if you're misbehaving, right? And you're going to lose fellowship. And, you could even get to a situation, and I'll talk about, like, hey, one of my children, let's say they break all of our rules, and they disrespect their mother, and they do all those kind of things. And I might even say, like, hey, you're not welcome back to this house until you get these things right. And I'll always say, like, but I'm not going to throw them in the fire. Like, they're not going to stop being my child because they're doing these things. And it's the same thing when we get saved. Like, we don't stop being God doesn't stop being our father just because we're living in sin, but our fellowship's broken. Okay, so we use that illustration all the time. And but the fact is, like, if you want to have a good relationship with the Lord, Well, do right, right? Follow him. Obey his rules. And how does he? Because he's the best example of a father, right? So if you're going to be a good father, you should look to the example of the Lord. Look at Acts chapter 10. Acts chapter 10, verse 34. Then Peter opened his mouth and said, "Of a truth I perceive that God is no respecter of persons, but in every nation he that feareth him and worketh righteousness is accepted with him." And so we see that if you are fearing God and you're working righteousness, hey, your relationship with God's going to be great. So the same thing is true with parents. Now, obviously, our relationship with God is a whole separate issue. But it's true with your parents as well. Like if you're obeying your parents' rules, if you're doing the things that they want you to do, then obviously you're going to be in good relationship with them. So let's say you do have two children, in this case, two sons. And one is going out and spending all the money and riotous living, and he's living in sin, he's doing all these kind of things. Who's going to be the favorite child? Who's going to seem to be the favorite child at that moment? Well, obviously, when that child was a embarrassment to his father, and he ran off and he took the money and did all that stuff, the oldest son, who's still at home serving with him and he's doing right, is going to be perceived to be his favorite child, and he's going to obviously be partial to him, and he's going to love him, and it's going to look like he loves him more than he loves the other child because of the situation that it's in. But when then that child comes home, it's like, hey, I want to show him I still love him. Even though he did this, and even though he ruined a portion of his life, and he ruined a portion of our relationship that's never going to be the same as it was. You know what I mean? I still love him, and he's still my child. It was never. I think the prodigal, the father in this story of the prodigal son is a great example of a father, and of course he's representing God in this story. But the other brother, he had his father's favor. He had everything. His father didn't hold anything back from him. He still has an inheritance. He's probably going to inherit the whole farm, But when the prodigal comes back, it's a time of rejoicing and all that. So mostly what we see from these stories is that it kind of comes down to a situational thing. Okay, and even if because of a certain situation, whatever the history is or whatever is going on at that moment that makes it appear though that you might favor one child over the other, look, I mean, you should recognize if you are spending more time or showing love, affection towards one child more than the other, you should kind of recognize that and be like, oh, you know what, I better start spending some more time with the other children, not to neglect this child, but just so that the partiality doesn't affect things. And it's just your job as a parent to be responsible for that. I don't think anybody probably in their heart really prefers one over another other than just the situation. Okay, and so you just kind of ride out those situations, and you try to be balanced, and you try to consider the other child, because if you don't, and they continue to see that the partiality, or maybe you just actually don't like a child for some reason, God forbid, then it's obviously their life is just going to be sour from that. I mean, just think about the case with any kids that don't have a father. Like, for instance, like you look at the jails, you look at the statistics, and a child without a father almost has no hope, it seems like, whenever you look. Well, you could actually be a father, and you could be at home and still be so distant from your child that it's almost as if that child doesn't have a father around, and it would have the same effect on them if that was the case. And so we don't ever want to do that. Okay, we always want to be remembering our responsibility to our children, to provide for and protect them, to discipline them when they need discipline, and we do that without partiality, no respecter of persons, other than conditional or situational. Then I believe that we will be just fine. Our kids go on to walk with the Lord in the way that they should go. All right, let's pray. Father, thank you for the great opportunity in the blessing that it is to have children and to raise children. And so many of us in this room have that blessing, but we also understand that with it comes a great responsibility and a great, many times, different challenges that come with the blessing. And so I pray, Lord, you help us. Help us to study your word and to learn from experience and learn from the experience of others with counseling, that you would guide us and direct us and help us to raise our children without partiality and without being a respecter of persons, Lord, as you have demonstrated to us. And I pray that you would guide us and direct us, help our families grow strong and serve you, and pass on another generation, Lord, of children who are going to grow up and carry on the work in our absence. I pray be blessed. And I'll just go ahead now, Lord, and pray for the food. We give you thanks for it and all those who work to prepare for it and to bring it here. And I pray you bless it to our bodies and bless the fellowship and all that goes with it. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.